Clara Hensley's heart raced as she stepped off the train at Tower Hill, the cold November wind biting through her coat. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the tops of the ancient stone walls and giving the tower an otherworldly silhouette against the gray sky. She clutched the official government grant letter in one hand and her recorder in the other, excitement and unease warping together into a tense thrill. This was her dream. Years of research, uncountable late nights studying myths and accounts of the tower's ghosts, now sanctioned by the authorities themselves. But as she approached the iron gates, the air seemed to shift. A weight settled over her shoulders, pressing down with centuries of unspoken sorrow. The familiar sounds of London, the distant horns of double-decker buses, the chatter of tourists, faded into silence. Clara could feel it in her bones. The tower was watching. That night, after setting up cameras in the Beauchamp Tower and the adjacent corridors, Clara sat alone in the shadowed quiet, headphones clamped over her ears. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the recording equipment and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Then came the faintest whisper, almost lost under the static. Eleanor. Clara froze. Her pulse quickened. The name meant nothing to her, yet it felt oddly intimate, as if someone who had known her entire life was calling out from beyond. She replayed the recording, but the whisper refused to yield its source. No one else was in the tower with her. Sleep evaded her. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the corners of her vision, and the old stones seemed to breathe beneath her fingers as she traced her notebook's margins with jittery hands. Clara had expected legends, imagined phantoms of history, but this was something far more immediate, something that knew her. By dawn, she realized that crossing the tower's threshold had done more than mark the beginning of a research project. It had awakened something ancient, something waiting for her specifically. And whatever it was, it had already spoken her name, Eleanor. The shadows of the past, expanded version. Clara descended into the tower's dungeons, her flashlight cutting through the damp darkness, illuminating centuries-old graffiti etched into the cold stone walls. The air smelled of mildew and iron, and every footstep echoed like a warning. Her recorder was running, capturing even the faintest sound, but tonight, the tower seemed determined to speak. As she turned a corner toward the chapel, a chill swept through her, stronger than any draft. There, in the dim candlelight, she saw it, a figure of regal bearing, a queen, but her head was gone. Yet she walked with the grace of life, her hands clasped as if in prayer, moving silently across the ancient floor. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She wanted to look away, to rationalize it as a trick of shadows. But something deeper, a pull she couldn't resist, kept her rooted in place. Clara fumbled with her camera, recording the apparition, the lens capturing the ethereal glow that surrounded the figure. The queen's gaze, though headless, seemed to pierce her very soul. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the walls, leaving behind only a faint scent of candle wax and roses. Heart-pounding, Clara reviewed the footage, but the recording refused to play. In its place, a distorted voice, old and brittle as parchment, crackled from the speaker. "You should not have come back." The words were more than a warning. They were a verdict. Goosebumps rose across her skin, and her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the camera. The tower had begun to reach into her, making her presence known, reminding her that she was no ordinary visitor. Despite her terror, Clara felt an irresistible compulsion to continue documenting. The whispers, the shifting shadows, the spectral presences, they were all pieces of a puzzle she had to solve. But the tower was testing her, watching, waiting, and she knew, deep down, that the shadows she had glimpsed were only the beginning. The Watcher in the Walls, expanded version. In the days following her first encounters, Theo, Clara's assistant, began noticing changes he couldn't ignore. Clara, normally meticulous and controlled, was becoming unmoored. At night, he would find her wandering the tower's corridors with eyes unfocused, murmuring in an unfamiliar, archaic form of English. Sometimes she hummed soft, haunting Tudor-era lullabies that sent chills down his spine. One evening, as the fog pressed thick against the tower's walls, Theo set up additional cameras to monitor Clara while she worked alone in the bloody tower. Hours passed. When he returned to check the footage, The screen showed a scene that made his stomach knot with dread. Clara had vanished. Every camera in the tower confirmed it. She had simply disappeared for 3 hours, as though swallowed by the stones themselves. When she finally returned, her clothes dusty, her hair disheveled, she spoke with an eerie calm. "I was waiting for the king's pardon." Her eyes gleamed with a strange, unplaceable familiarity, and Theo's unease deepened. Security footage added another layer of terror. Every time Clara moved, shadows lingered where no one should have been, shapes that twisted and followed her in unnatural patterns. The tower itself seemed alive, its walls observing her, acknowledging her presence. Theo tried to reach her rational mind, to remind her of who she was, but the longer she spent inside the tower, the more she seemed to slip into another self. And though she laughed and smiled at him during the day, her nights were increasingly claimed by the unseen forces inhabiting the centuries-old fortress. By the end of the week, Theo understood a grim truth. The tower wasn't just haunted. It was watching her, shaping her, coaxing a past long buried back into flesh and memory. And whatever followed her through the walls, waiting silently in the shadows, was patient and relentless. The name beneath the dust, expanded version. Clara spent the following day in the tower's dusty archives, a labyrinth of forgotten documents and brittle parchment that smelled of decay and old ink. The flickering light from her lantern cast long, trembling shadows across the shelves, giving the room a haunted stillness. As she sifted through records, one particular ledger drew her attention, a faded entry, almost erased by time, listing a noblewoman named Eleanor Hensley, accused of treason and executed in 1536. Her hands shook as she compared the portraits of Eleanor with her own reflection in the archival glass. The resemblance was uncanny. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, the same restless eyes. Clara's mind swirled with disbelief. Could this be a coincidence? Or was something far stranger at play? As she delved deeper into the tower's forgotten records, she discovered that Eleanor's story had been systematically erased. Her name had been replaced in history books by another woman, her crime attributed to someone else entirely. Clara felt the walls of the archive close and around her, the air thickening with centuries of injustice. The whispers returned, faint and urgent, brushing against her consciousness like the touch of ghostly fingers. That night, as she reviewed her notes in the quiet of her temporary quarters within the tower, condensation formed on the window pane. Slowly, a hand, pale, translucent, and trembling, traced words across the fog. "You remember now." Clara staggered back, heart hammering, feeling the weight of recognition and terror intertwined. It was as if the tower itself was reminding her of a life she could not consciously recall, a past buried beneath layers of history and dust. Eleanor Hensley was not just a name in a ledger. She was calling to her, reaching through time to reclaim what had been stolen. From that moment, Clara understood that her investigation had moved beyond academic curiosity. She was no longer simply documenting history. She was awakening it. And the tower was listening. The Cursed Hour, expanded version. Midnight came like a slow, creeping shadow over the tower. The air had grown dense, almost viscous, pressing against Clara's skin as she made her way to the central courtyard. She glanced at her watch, and then froze. The hands had stopped, frozen at exactly 12. Around her, every clock in the tower, grand clocks in the halls, pocket watches left by visitors, even the faint ticking of her own equipment, ceased their motion. Time itself seemed to have been suspended. Then it began. Ghostly forms emerged from the stone walls, their movements echoing centuries-old horrors. Clara saw the condemned prisoners of the tower reliving their final moments, men and women begging for mercy, heads bowed before silent executioners, eyes wide with eternal fear. Their motions were perfectly repeated, a looping nightmare that had no beginning and no end. A chill ran down Clara's spine as a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in full armor, faceless, dragging heavy chains that clanged with deafening resonance, reverberating through the tower's empty halls. His presence seemed to distort reality itself, bending the light and shadow around him. And then, above the clamor of spectral suffering, a voice hissed directly into Clara's mind. "Set us free, Eleanor." Her body froze. The name again, Eleanor. Not a whisper this time, but a demand, a command intertwined with centuries of anguish. She realized, with dawning horror, that the ghosts weren't merely echoes of the past. They were aware, watching her, and responding to her very existence. Clara's recorder captured everything, though the screen distorted the images into flickering, impossible shapes. She knew she was witnessing more than hauntings. The tower itself had become a cage, its walls alive with sorrow and vengeance, feeding off the cycles of death that had occurred within them. And now, the tower had singled her out. Time had stopped, but history was alive, and it wanted something from her. The blood of betrayal, expanded version. Theo had been scouring the tower's archives for hours, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain Clara's increasingly unhinged behavior. Hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, he discovered a sealed journal, its leather cracked and faintly damp. With trembling hands, he opened it, revealing the spidery handwriting of Eleanor Hensley herself. As Clara read the journal under the flickering light of her lantern, the words leapt off the page with shocking immediacy. Eleanor had served the queen faithfully, yet betrayal had come swift and merciless. Accused of sorcery after warning of a dark omen in the tower, a comet streaking across the night sky, she had been condemned to die. The diary detailed her terror, the cold cruelty of the guards, and the quiet, suffocating dread of the tower that now surrounded Clara herself. But then, something inexplicable happened. The words began to shift beneath Clara's eyes, morphing into her own handwriting. Lines she had never written appeared on the page, as though Eleanor's voice and her own had merged across time. Memories flooded her mind in fragmented flashes, the scraping of boots across cobblestones, the harsh grip of hands dragging her through the courtyard, and the echoing whisper of the executioner's blade. Clara's pulse raced as she realized the truth. These were not just visions. They were memories, her memories. Tears blurred her vision as the tower seemed to respond, walls groaning under invisible weight, shadows flickering with anticipation. Clara understood now. The betrayal had never ended. It had followed her through centuries, carried forward in her very soul. The tower was not only a prison for the dead, it was a mirror for the living, reflecting the sins and injustices that had yet to be reconciled. Theo, witnessing her transformation, felt a cold dread settle over him. He realized that Clara's connection to Eleanor was no mere coincidence. Whatever the tower demanded, whatever it had awakened in her, it was far bigger than history. It was personal. The prison of souls, expanded version. Clara's investigation had taken on a new, terrifying clarity. The tower was not merely haunted, it was alive. Not in the sense of creaking timbers or shifting stones, but sentient, ancient, and hungry. Every corridor, every cell, every shadow seemed to pulse with a consciousness older than memory, aware of every step she took. As she pored over maps, execution records, and hidden documents, the truth became undeniable. The tower fed on the grief, guilt, and injustice of those who had perished within its walls. The souls of the wrongly condemned were trapped in endless cycles, reliving their deaths over and over. Their suffering bound them, and in turn, bound the tower itself. Each ghost was a thread in a tapestry of torment, woven across centuries. Then came the whisper. At first, it was faint, almost playful, curling around her like smoke. "You are mine again." Clara's blood ran cold. The voice was not a ghost's. It was the tower itself, claiming her, sensing the dormant connection that tied her to Eleanor Hensley. She felt invisible hands brushing along her spine, guiding her deeper into the dungeons, showing her visions of spectral courts, shadowed trials, and executions repeated ad infinitum. The tower was teaching her, warning her, and perhaps testing her resolve. Theo watched from the corridor, horror etched across his face, as Clara's eyes glazed over. She moved as if guided by unseen strings, her body responding to commands she could not comprehend. The tower's influence was absolute. It was more than a building. It was a predator, and she had walked straight into its jaws. Clara realized the full weight of her predicament. This was not simply an investigation. She was being drawn into a living history, one that demanded her participation, her obedience, and ultimately, her identity. The tower was awakening something buried in her soul, and there was no escaping its grasp. The mirror of the past, expanded version. Clara had begun to notice changes in herself she could not explain. Small bruises appeared along her neck and wrists, faint at first, as if pressed by invisible hands. Old scars, ones she had never had in her current life, rose like faint maps over her skin, aching with the memory of pain she could not place. Even her reflection in ordinary glass sometimes seemed wrong, shadows flickering where there should be none, eyes glinting with an unnatural knowledge. It was in the Queen's house, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain, that Clara discovered the mirror. Its surface was not like any she had seen before. It shimmered faintly, like liquid metal, and when she gazed into it, her breath caught in her throat. The face staring back was not her own, it was Eleanor's. High cheekbones, pale skin, and eyes filled with centuries of anguish. It moved, speaking without words, as if trying to communicate the truth that had been buried for almost 500 years. Theo, standing behind her, felt a cold dread tighten his chest. He tried to pull her away, but the moment he touched her, the doors slammed shut with a deafening clang. Every exit from the room had vanished, the hallways dissolving into shadows that shifted like smoke. They were trapped, not by walls, but by time itself. The tower's influence tightened around them, warping the present into the past. The courtyard outside replayed scenes from 1536, guards dragging Eleanor toward the scaffold, the silent screams of prisoners, the glint of steel under torchlight. Clara felt herself pulled forward, stepping in Eleanor's footsteps, memories flooding her mind like a river breaking through a dam. She realized the tower's temporal loop was complete. They were living history, bound to the execution and torment of centuries ago. Theo's fear became panic. He tried to escape, to reason, but every attempt led him back to the same corridor, the same mirror, the same unnerving reflection. The tower had claimed its prisoners, and now Clara, in ways he could scarcely understand, was both its witness and its key. The execution returns, expanded version. The tower's air had grown unbearably thick, almost tangible, as the anniversary of Eleanor Hensley's execution approached. Every stone seemed to hum with anticipation, vibrating with the echoes of centuries-old terror. Clara walked through the familiar corridors, but they were no longer ordinary. Spectral figures crowded every corner, half-formed and flickering, their faces twisted in eternal anguish. Ghosts of every century appeared, prisoners who had suffered in silence, their mouths opening in wordless pleas for release. The chants began softly at first, a haunting cadence that resonated deep in Clara's chest, then rising to a deafening chorus. Heads bowed, hands outstretched, eyes imploring. The tower itself seemed to move with them, reshaping corridors, stretching walls, bending time into impossible loops. The past was collapsing into the present, and Clara was at its center. She felt it in her bones, the truth she had been running from. Eleanor Hensley was not a distant ancestor, not just a historical figure. She was Clara. Every memory that had felt foreign, every fragment of fear, every bruise, every whisper, was a piece of a life lived centuries ago. The tower had drawn her back not by chance, but by design, compelling her to confront her past, her identity, and her fate. Tears blurred her vision as the spectral crowd pressed closer. For the first time, she let herself surrender to the realization. She was Eleanor reincarnated, called back to finish what had been left incomplete. But understanding the truth brought no relief, only a chilling weight. Freeing the tower's trapped souls meant reliving her own execution, stepping willingly into the shadow of her death. Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears as the tower seemed to lean in around her, whispering, urging, demanding. Every ghost watched, every shadow waited, every stone remembered. And as the first echoes of the execution bell rang out in her ears, Clara felt the full, unrelenting power of the tower, time, death, and memory converging into a single moment, and she knew she could not escape it. The decision was hers alone. The last toll of the tower, expanded version. Dawn had yet to break when Clara stepped toward the scaffold, the cold stone floor beneath her feet alive with centuries of sorrow. The tower was silent, but the air vibrated with the echoes of every execution it had witnessed. Spectral forms emerged from the shadows, prisoners of every era, their faces a blur of hope, fear, and longing. They surrounded her, a sea of the wrongly condemned, their eyes fixed on her with pleading intensity. Clara's hands shook, but she held her head high, stepping deliberately into the place where Eleanor had met her death centuries ago. The spectral executioner waited, blade gleaming unnaturally, its presence both terrifying and inevitable. Time had no meaning here. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum, every breath was a lifetime, and every glance carried the weight of history. With a final, steadying inhale, Clara closed her eyes and accepted the role the tower had carved for her. The blade fell. There was no pain, no scream, only a brilliant, searing light that engulfed the courtyard, sweeping through the tower like a cleansing storm. Ghosts dissolved into rays of white and gold, their tortured cries fading into the quiet of release. The walls of the tower seemed to sigh, a deep, resonant sound like stone finally exhaling after centuries of grief. When the first morning light pierced the tower's gates, guards found the corridors empty. Clara was gone. Theo was gone. Only the camera remained, still recording. On its lens, mist curled into words, scrawled by an unseen hand. The tower remembers. And then, faintly, carried on the morning wind, a whisper reached the silent stones, a woman's voice, calling Clara's name. Though the curse had been broken, the tower's memory endured. The cycle had shifted, but not entirely ended. Somewhere within its ancient walls, the past waited, patient and unyielding, for the next soul drawn into its shadow. The tower, it seemed, would always remember.